A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke. Jesus told his disciples a parable about the necessity for them to pray always without becoming weary. He said, "There was a judge in a certain town who neither feared God nor respected any human being. And a widow in that town used to come to him and say, 'Render a just decision for me against my adversary.' For a long time the judge was unwilling, but eventually he thought, 'While it is true that I neither fear God nor respect any human being, because this widow keeps bothering me, I shall deliver a just decision for her, lest she finally come and strike me.' The Lord said, 'Pay attention to what the dishonest judge says. Will not God then secure the rights of his chosen ones, who call out to him day and night? Will he be slow to answer them? I tell you, he will see to it that justice is done for them speedily. But when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth?'" The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ. This weekend's Gospel, we're beginning to transition to the end. We're towards the end of the Gospel of Luke, just as we are towards the end, or nearing the end of our liturgical year, which always brings about these ominous readings to be ready, to be prepared, because at an unknown day and an unknown hour, just like the liturgical year ends, our life will end. The earth as we know it will pass away, and we will sit, just us and God, to render an account of our lives for God, who is a just and honest judge, to either reward us with heaven or hell. Again, as we talked about a couple months ago, whatever we would like, whatever our deeds have deemed worthy, because God is love, the very essence of God, God's very being is love itself. As St. John tells us, God is love. And so he loves us so much that he allows us to go to heaven or hell based on which one is more suited for our mindset, our approach to things. Are we like, in a way, are we like this dishonest judge? Are we like the rich man we heard about a couple weeks ago? Or are we like this persistent widow? Are we like the poor man Lazarus? What is our destiny? It's up to us. God isn't just there sitting and making judgments or rulings, but he's rather putting his stamp of approval on our lives. He's rather deeming us worthy based on how we approach things and people in our lives of our final destination. But we're called to be like the persistent widow. This persistent widow who seems to be an annoyance. That's the baseline how we could view this widow in today's gospel. But I think first we have to peel back the curtains a little bit and look at what widows were back in biblical times, back in the days of Jesus, when he would use parables to talk about things that all the people would understand. Stuff that we might not understand as well nowadays, especially with the agricultural parables, or the parables involving manual labor, or different statuses in life. One of those being a widow. Now, naturally, we still have widows today, and they mean the same thing. It's an unmarried, or a woman whose husband passes away, so she's unmarried now. But in Jesus' time, it was very unfortunate, obviously. It's unfortunate to lose your husband, but essentially you lose everything else, because you couldn't remarry. And because we know that women did not have much status in society back then, the women couldn't even get jobs. They couldn't make an income. They couldn't earn money. They really couldn't do anything but just sit around and, in all honesty, kind of wait to die. That's what it was like to be a widow. Where the widows in Jesus' day and age were some of the most forgotten marginalized, neglected, oppressed members of society because they lost their husband, they lost their income, they lost any chance of marriage because they couldn't remarry. They lost all protection. They lost pretty much everything. And so these are comparable in a way to the lepers that we heard about last weekend, where basically it was a death sentence to have this status. To have this status of this contagious disease of leprosy, or this unfortunate current of events leading to be a widow. And it is until Jesus comes and changes the status quo, and Jesus tells us to care for the widow and the orphan, very neglected, very marginalized and oppressed members of society, to care for them, to welcome them into your home, treat them as one of your own. Whatsoever you do for one of these least brothers and sisters of mine, you do for me, Jesus tells us. And the same is true for us today, where we are to look out for the poor, the vulnerable, the marginalized, the oppressed. Even though it might not be widows per se, we still are called to look out for the poor. The Lord hears the cry of the poor, as the psalmist says, and even in today's responsorial psalm, and there's an account that our help comes from the Lord who made heaven and earth. And that's the prayer of every single person on earth, including the persistent widow, who recognized that her help comes from the Lord. The widow in this gospel can be likened to each one of us. And the unjust judge can be likened to God, although, full disclaimer, God is not an unjust judge, and God is not like the judge in this gospel reading, who is disrespectful and does not give anyone the time of day to listen to their needs, and simply acts because he's tired of being pestered and he fears retribution. But rather, God likes to hear our prayer. God likes us to have conversation with him. That's what prayer is. Prayer is something more than a conversation with God. And so God likes when we come to him, when we bring all of our prayers, our petitions, our pleas, our concerns, our needs, our anxieties, and our thanksgivings. We bring those to the Lord so that he might hear them, and his heart might be softened, and he begins to love us all the more because we're spending time with him. We're praying to him. So there is essentially what we're called to do, following the example of the persistent widow. We are to be persistent. We are to be relentless in prayer. That's the point of the parable that Jesus gives to us. It literally says that he's teaching his disciples about the necessity to pray always without becoming weary. St. Paul would reiterate this about less than a century later when he says to pray without ceasing. Pray without ceasing. That seems insurmountable, that seems impossible. And I remember getting that question a few years ago from someone. And it was a good question, We hear this, we're to pray without ceasing, but how can you possibly pray without ceasing? And I'm not saying that I am good at this myself. But my answer was this: that you take every action of your life and you turn it into a prayer. Even the mundane tasks of daily life, we can invite God into these moments. And the saints have told us this as well. Doing the laundry, making dinner, cleaning the car, getting gas, driving, walking, sitting in front of the computer, sitting in class, going to bed, waking up, eating breakfast. All these times in our lives are opportunities where we can invite the Lord to be with us. We can pray before and after these daily encounters. And eventually prayer will begin to infiltrate between them as well. We will begin to be able to pray during these encounters and these actions. And eventually we personally will be able to pray without ceasing. That's on a personal note. But the church, in its structure as well, is also very equipped to pray without ceasing in a beautiful way. If we look at the liturgical life of the church, and namely in terms of the Mass and the Liturgy of the Hours, the Mass we should be familiar with, and the Liturgy of the Hours, which some of you may have heard of before, is this structured prayer, including different hours like evening prayer, vespers, morning prayer, night prayer. You might have heard of some of these before. And it is a requirement for priests and some religious to pray these prayers, these hours throughout the day to varying degrees, and some lay persons, some seminarians, some faithful may take up hours as well in their own personal devotions. But the Liturgy of the Hours is structured in a way, if you've heard the phrase, it's 5 o'clock somewhere. Where literally at every point in the year, in a day, in the world, it's a certain time of the day. It's time for evening prayer. It's time for morning prayer. So if you look at that structure, someone is always praying. And that's how this universality of the church is really designed, where there's always a Mass going on. There's always a sacramental life of the church being engaged. And there's always an hour of the Liturgy of the Hours being prayed at some point around the world. It's set up similarly to Moses in today's first reading, when he had to hold his hands up, and even other people had to help hold his hands up when his arms would grow weary. Aaron and Hur would help Moses to keep his arms uplifted so that the Israelites would defeat the Amalekites. So too the universal church, the Catholic Church, the worldwide church, is able to hold up one another to make sure that we do not grow weary, we do not grow slothful, we don't give up in prayer. We're accountability partners for one another. We're assistants. And we help one another on our journey of faith and our life of prayer. Because it almost seems impossible to be able to pray without ceasing, without growing weary. To be like this persistent widow who might seem to turn God off, but God is not turned off by our prayers. God might be turned off by moaning, whining, complaining, if that's all we do. But if it's wholehearted prayer for our own good, just like the widow, if she was going for her own good, she wanted a just judgment. If we're looking for good, for healing, for guidance, for direction, for a relationship with the Lord, then He will never turn away our prayer, and He will answer our prayers in His time and in His way, if we have faith. That's what's difficult sometimes. It's God's way or highway, not my way or highway. So my brothers and sisters, let's pray. Let's make it a habit. It will take time, it will take effort, but let's make it a habit to pray always. To pray more than we ought. To help one another in prayer, to hold up each other's arms, as well as the arms of the universal church, to carry our weight according to our state in life. And eventually we'll be able to pray without ceasing. And when the Son of Man returns, He will indeed find faith on this earth.